Welcome everyone, I'm Kathleen McMahon, and I'm here today to show you how accessibility flavored React components make your design system delicious. Now, before we begin, let's get some details out of the way. And only if my clicker would work, and we're gonna make sure it does. There we go. My slide deck will be posted on Noticed, including the links to the resources that I briefly touch upon. I'll also post the URL to this deck later on Twitter after this presentation. You can follow me at Resource11 on Twitter, Instagram, and GitHub. Now, here's an outline of what we'll be covering today. Oh yeah, I have an agenda. Why accessibility first? Design systems are a cookbook. Design systems and React. We're going to go over some patterns for accessible icons, buttons, components, inputs, and disclosure widgets. We're also going to briefly touch a little bit on documentation before wrapping up. I'm going to back up again so I can introduce myself a little bit better. So I'm an engineer and a designer, and I like to speak about things, but I also race bikes very, very badly. As you can see on the screen here, there I am hopping over barriers, racing in the mud, and looking in pain. And I do it very badly. Mostly you will see me in costume, racing 2 laps to your 6 at the back of the pack on a single speed bike with a bunch of onlookers in the crowd laughing at me, toasting with their beverages. Now, mostly, this is where you'll find me, unless something happens. Like perhaps if a pandemic kicks in our doors, like a dude wearing a big bird costume, then your racing season is postponed. So while I'm an engineer and a designer and a super slow bike racer, I'm also a dev dinosaur. And I find it fascinating to see how far we've come from the tools we had for computing, like the Amiga 2000, and software like Photoshop 3. Anyone remember that? What about Director? This is the storage we used. 3.5-inch floppy drives, Bernoulli drives, SciQuest drives, zip drives. I still have my zip drive. It's pretty awesome. We also used a lot of books for reference. We weren't using Google. So this is my library of O'Reilly books, Debabilizer books, CSS books, Director books, Infinity books. While our browser choices were minimal, Netscape anyone? Our stack has stood the test of time. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Fast forward to now, and the industry is moving at a really fast pace, and it feels like there is a JavaScript framework released every week. And it can feel overwhelming to keep up, much less find a place where you can thrive. It really feels like a fire hose of information, especially if you have both design and engineering skills and love to use that fundamental stack. Woo! But fear not. Dinosaurs are always the hotness. I have to describe this image because it makes me laugh so many times every time I see it. This is a dinosaur, a person in an inflatable dinosaur suit jumping off a pier, doing a backflip into a floaty raft into a lily pad-filled pond. Enjoy. It's a joyful dinosaur, and that is who I am. And that's why dinosaurs are always a hotness. Now, getting back to the point. Why dinosaurs are the hotness? Because those old school HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills that we download and transferable, no matter which framework you use. And those skills will give you an edge in the industry where the div has become the reluctant king. So before COVID flattened pretty much everything, I was the tech lead for O'Reilly Media's design system. I learned a lot while I was there about streamlining component libraries and making optimizations in documentation. If you've ever worked on a design system, you know that there are a lot of things to consider. And great design systems combine 2 key factors: user experience and end user experience. However, just like herding a bunch of really fluffy kittens, creating a design system can be tough with so many moving parts. If you are rebooting a design system, you will have to choose what to tackle first. If your design system team is small, you have to be strategic. For example, if you have any business logic in your components, your first priority should be to extract those out and build your components with accessibility in mind. Fix your colors, your components, and then reboot your docs. You may ask, why accessibility first? Well, our users have varied needs, and because so often accessibility is what's handled last, which sends a poor message to our users. If you've read the WebA Million report, the results are depressing. With the amount of errors found on pages, it's 97.8%. Unlabeled inputs, 59%. And 60.1% of unnecessary ARIA attributes. 61% of pages have this. We're making the web worse in the name of good intentions. While we have things like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to follow, which really honestly is a really low bar to surpass, we've been missing the mark in the industry when it comes to making sure all our users can use our apps well. Imagine though, if you had accessibility baked into some commonly used components. A design system is the perfect place for this. I like to say your design system is a cookbook, and cookbooks have a personality. My mom is a serious fan of cooking, and lately I've been enjoying digging into the cookbooks that she's collected over the years to read how recipes have evolved over time. If you take a look at some of the cookbooks published in the 1940s through 60s, and look past the outdated views like why nearly 9 million women cherish this cookbook, you'll find some interesting recipes and some questionable food choices, like this food combination, which is Jell-O and shellfish in a mold. Delicious. But also, there's an impressive level of detail paid to the structure of every part of the cooking process. There's even a section in these cookbooks on table settings and entertaining. This is very similar to how a design system works. Now, what does this have to do with React? Well, there's always some debate about how using a JavaScript library creates inaccessible apps. Yet, React fully supports building accessible websites by using standard HTML and CSS techniques. A better way to think of React is to consider it a kitchen utensil. It's not the only utensil in your kitchen. You are the cook. In my opinion, it's up to the developer to have that standard HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and accessibility knowledge to be able to leverage a utensil correctly, and that includes React. That said, if your developers are unsure how to start building inclusive apps, empower them with your design system. Build some features into your components to help them along. Then you can start celebrating when your coworkers make those apps accessible without you having to ask for it. So components are your tried and true recipes, and WCAG is your reference material. Creating a component is like following a recipe. First, you start off with your high quality ingredients. That's your semantic HTML. You mix in some seasonings, just a touch of ARIA attributes. Follow the directions, it's your documentation, and provide helpful hints as best practices for your users. Let's take those principles. Hi, Thor, that's my cat, Thor. Let's take those principles and apply them to some components. Starting off with icons. Icons can be either informative or decorative. Informative icons need to be paired with descriptive text to be perceivable by screen readers. Decorative icons need to be hidden from screen readers because they don't add enough significant value to your app. But wait, icons can be interpreted in so many different ways. True. For example, you may see the heart symbol used to favorite something in an app. Other apps may use a star. This leaves way too much for interpretation by the user. Ideally, you should be pairing any icons you use with visible text. This way, your users will have a clear context on that icon's purpose. Of course, there's a big but in here. This depends on the buy-in you get for icon usage for your designs, and whether you can get that design approved that uses a label paired with an icon like this, which I have faith in you. I think you can. But that said, in general terms, there is more than one way to create an accessible icon. Two of the most recent ways are SVGs and icon fonts. Yes, Thor. At O'Reilly, we initially used SVG icons in our design system, combined into a sprite sheet. Yet we ran into some problems when we started testing. We discovered a bug in Safari on High Sierra when we were testing in VoiceOver, and VoiceOver would announce every single one of those 100 or so icons in our sprite sheet. It made me sad and very weepy, like Natalie Portman sobbing in a corner. So we had to think fast and find a different solution. We converted all our icons to a font set for the time being and chose to revisit the SVG icon solution later, since that High Sierra bug has now been fixed. So let's go over an example of how we make an accessible icon component using the semantic HTML and the icon font technique. This is what you'll typically see as an icon font pattern in the wild, a span with a class. But it's not accessible. This is an accessible icon pattern. Let's break it down. The span, we have a span containing our icon font, and it's been sprinkled with a pinch of aria hidden equals true to hide the icon font from screen readers. We also have a sibling span to that first span, and it contains the descriptive name for our icon. That span has a visually hidden class added to it. This will remove the visual presentation of the text, yet keep that text available to screen readers. There is also a wrapping span surrounding these two sibling spans. In that wrapping span, we use a CSS class to convert the span's native display property from inline to inline block. This way, we can support margin and padding customization in CSS on all four sides of the element. Notice that we're using spans all the way down for all three elements here. This is on purpose for when we pair this component with a button later. Now, before we refactor this pattern into a React component and JSX syntax, let's consider whether this icon is informative or decorative. If our icon is informative, we keep this markup as is, because informative icons should announce. If our icon is decorative, we'd add this aria hidden attribute to the wrapping span to ensure the entire group is not announced to a screen reader. Now that we have an accessible icon pattern, let's pop this into a functional component and convert this syntax to JSX. We're going to change that class attribute to class name, convert that true string to a Boolean value of true, and self-close that empty span. And voila, now this is a static icon component in JSX. Let's make this component more flexible now and expand that syntax to support 3 incoming prompts: icon hidden, icon name, icon title, and add some guardrails. It's important to create guardrails for your components so you can be sure that the developers are always using the accessibility features that you've mixed in for them. For our icon components, we've added 3 guardrails. The first guardrail we've set up is a check if the icon name the dev passes into the component is in our icon library. If the icon doesn't exist in the library, the component doesn't render in the app. The second guardrail we've added is to ensure that if the developer doesn't pass in descriptive text to that icon title prop, the icon's default name is always exposed as fallback. The last guardrail we've added is for the icon hidden prop. If the developer passes in icon hidden and sets that to true, the containing spans will render in the DOM with an aria hidden equals true attribute attached. If no icon hidden prop is passed into the icon component, the ARIA hidden attribute isn't attached to the wrapping span at all. This way, we're guaranteeing that the icon will read out to screen readers no matter what, unless the developer purposely specifies otherwise by passing in that icon hidden value. This true or null pattern works well with HTML attributes that only need to be added if the value exists. ARIA hidden is one of those attributes. You may still be saying, what about SVGs? What if I haven't rolled my own icon set? Well, there are great options out there to do this with SVGs as well. For example, Font Awesome is still a great option for this. In fact, Font Awesome now has an official React component that you can use, and it has been built with accessibility in mind. It's pretty straightforward to use this component, and it adds the right properties for you under the hood by default for an SVG. There is, however, a slight bug if you want to use this component as a standalone informative icon. Say you have popped in this Font Awesome icon into your component, and you want it to announce as a beverage rather than its default name of coffee in this case. And you pass in that ARIA label of beverage prop to this component. Yes, that ARIA label equals beverage attribute will render in the DOM. However, because the SVG element already has an ARIA hidden attribute attached and it's set to true, that ARIA label will do nothing in this case. It will not announce. However, you can get around this by using the icon component we built and by swapping out the span using the CSS class. It's my kitty. Okay, so we're going to swap out that CSS class. Then you can remove the unnecessary ARIA hidden from the wrapping span here. And by swapping in this Font Awesome component, you can leverage the visually hidden span to make your icon informative. Moving on to buttons. Buttons perform an action on the page. Buttons should look and act like a button. And buttons get screen reader and keyboard functionality for free. Our high quality ingredient here is the button element. We're going to sprinkle in a little bit of ARIA label attribute support for instances where we have multiple buttons on the page. For example, if we have multiple buttons on the page that have the same name, and we're going to give context to screen reader users. For example, have you ever had a page where you have 10 read more buttons on the page? How will you know what you're reading more about? With this ARIA label, you can know that this button will allow you to read more about dinosaurs. It's important when using an ARIA label like this to match the first words in the ARIA label with the button text to support voice recognition software. Notice here the button text is read more and the ARIA label is read more about dinosaurs. If your app needs to support localization, excuse me, our Adrian Roselli recently wrote a great article with a different pattern that uses the ARIA described by attribute. That article will be shared in the resources later. Now, this is an accessible button in JSX syntax. If we want to support button text with icons, we mix in our icon component. And we are going to wrap our button contents in a span for positioning. Notice here that we're using inline level elements inside buttons. We are not nesting buttons or other controls inside a button's children because that's not valid HTML. This is why we built our icon with all spans. The JSX is popped into the component's render method and add some props for flexibility, including ARIA label and the children prop to support custom ARIA label and button text. Button ref to support focus management use cases, an icon name for whichever icon we want to use in our icon component, an on-click handler to call when the button is clicked, and disabled button support using the true or null pattern. Also, we're going to add some support for button size and button types. And the types are submit, button, and reset. And the default type for this button, default type for any button without a type added, is submit under the hood. The one guardrail we add to the button component ensures that if no icon name is passed into the button, no icon will render in the button. Inputs. Inputs need labels and error messages, and labeled inputs give all users more context. And no, placeholders are not labels. Avoid using placeholders instead of labels, otherwise your users will lose context for what the purpose of the input. Placeholders are hard to style across browsers, and they are not auto-translated. Build your component to minimize horizontal scrolling and stack your labels above the input and error messages below the input to support screen magnification users, because they are relying on zooming through a window that looks about the size of a credit card. You can also place the error message right below the label for even better discoverability. Adam Silver has a really great pattern for that and a good article on pairing labels and error messages right above the input. Now, this is an accessible input pattern. It's a bit hard to read, so let's zoom in. We're going to start with our high quality ingredients, semantic HTML, pair our labels and error messages to the input. Notice here that our labels for attribute, which is input foo, matches the ID of the span of error foo. So those are, actually those are, I'm gonna back up for a second. I am distracted by cat meowing. We're gonna pair our error labels and error messages to the input. So inputs need those labels and error messages. And in JSX, we are gonna associate our label with the input by pairing the label's HTML4 prop value with the input's ID value. We're going to mix in some key ARIA spices for validation. We're going to add ARIA invalid, ARIA required, and ARIA required attribute, and pair the ARIA described by attribute with the error text ID's value. We're also going to add the ARIA live equals polite attribute to the error message we are going to also add the ARIA live, I can speak, I promise. We're going to add an ARIA live equals polite attribute to the error message span to announce errors to screen readers when they're at a convenient stopping point in their browsing. To make this component more flexible, we're going to mix in some disabled attribute support and some synthetic event support. For example, the on change and on key press synthetic events to capture keyboard actions, and add that true and null handling pattern for any of those Boolean props. Add your guardrails here. If the developer does not pass in a label, the whole input will not render. Neither will that icon. This will help guide developers to follow best practices when implementing an input component. And soon it will become second nature for no matter if you're using a library, a framework, or just vanilla HTML. Same goes for error handling. If the developer doesn't pass in the invalid prop and the error message to the component, that error message will not render. Disclosure widgets. A disclosure widget is an interactive pattern that uses a button to control the visibility of a section of content. This pattern is great because it's flexible, keyboard and mouse operable, and its base functionality is very similar for more than one type of interactive component. Some common patterns are nav menus, toggle tips, and settings disclosures. Other types of widget patterns are custom select menus and autocompletes. We won't be talking about those two today because in addition to the optional enter, spacebar, and escape keys that can be added into menu lists, these two patterns, select menus and autocompletes, also need up, down arrow keys and home and key support, and it's just a lot to cover in a short presentation. One important thing to note, a tooltip is not a toggle tip. The interactions are different. A tooltip's interactivity revolves around hovering over the tool tip and focusing on it with, maybe focusing on it with a keyboard. This can be problematic though, for any sort of touch device that doesn't support hover, like a non-mouse pointer or an eye tracker. Also, anyone using a screen magnifier may accidentally dismiss a tooltip by moving their field of view and hovering away from the tooltip. Sarah Higley has lots of articles on why tooltips are problematic, and I will share those resources later on. The three primary interactions we need to focus on for a disclosure widget are the spacebar and enter key, which comes natively when you use a button to open the disclosure. We also need to support the escape key clicks and mouse clicks. For special cases, like a search menu that toggles into view, you can optionally send focus to the first item in the open container. Whoa, Nelly. This is an accessible disclosure widget pattern. I'm going to zoom in and break it down piece by piece, and then we'll go into some demo. First, we want to support some incoming props. For example, we're going to pass in an ARIA label, classes, an icon, and size and text to the disclosure widget's button. A disclosure widget is a button paired with a sibling container, and the button controls whether that container is open or closed by clicking on the button. So these first 5 props are some props that we're going to pass into our button component. The children component is anything that we're going to pass into our disclosure container. The first item ref prop is a way that we can pass in a reference to our widget in case something in our widget's contents needs to have focus sent to it when the widget is open. We're also going to pass in 2 more props, which is any other CSS classes we want to pass into the icon for any type of custom overrides, and whether the disclosure button will be an icon only type of button. Also, if you notice here, this is what it will look like when you pass it. This is the pattern. You have a div that is a containing div that surrounds a button paired with a sibling div. And the button here is our button component. And it is also a type of button because we are not submitting any form elements. We're just using the button for interaction on the page. The button needs to control the visibility of this sibling container. So what we're going to do here is use the React useState hook and use it to set an isOpen variable and declare a setIsOpen function to control the visibility of the div's state. So first, we're going to declare a toggle open function, and in that function, whenever that function is activated, we are going to toggle the state of setIsOpen from true to false and back. And we're going to take that toggle open function and pass it in to our buttons on click prop. We're also going to pass that isOpen state to our ARIA expanded prop because we need screen reader users to understand that the button one, that the ARIA, we have these two, sorry, my cat has distracted me. We have these 2 attributes here that we're going to add to our button component, ARIA expanded and ARIA has pop-up. Now the ARIA expanded attribute added to the button allows the button to one, announce to screen readers whether it's controlling a sibling container and whether that container is expanded or not. In that ARIA expanded prop is paired with the ARIA has pop-up prop. And the ARIA has pop-up prop is set to true here because the button is paired with that sibling div, which is our pop-up. So those two props are very important to have in our button component to have a disclosure widget pattern. If you notice with our is open state is passed into the ARIA expanded prop. So whenever is open is true, ARIA expanded is true. Also in our div, the children in our div, basically the content of our button container that is opening and closing for our disclosure only shows if the is open property is true, is open state is true. We're also adding this hidden attribute to that disclosure widget's container div that will only toggle on if the state of is open is set to true. Otherwise, that hidden attribute will not attach to that div at all. Now, next, making sure I'm in the right place. I am. Okay, next up is focus management. So React's useRef hook is used here to initialize a reference to pass to our button because we need to make sure that if anything in that wrapping div is clicked, one, if that wrapping div is the disclosure widget is open, and if the user presses the escape key, or if the user presses the escape key, if the disclosure widget is open, the disclosure widget 1 first will close because set is open will be set to false and our is open state will be set to false and the ARIA expanded attribute will be set to false. But also, if the user presses escape, the disclosure closes, but also the button receives focus again because we have that button ref that we established here. We have a const button ref when we've initialized it to null. And once we hit that escape key from an open disclosure widget and we press it, the set is open is set to false and the button is now focused again. And this is important because when you open disclosure widget and you're tabbing through it and you hit escape, all users will be brought back to the area where they activated that tooltip. And that way users are continuing to have the context of where they are on the page. Mouse clicks outside the widget need consideration as well. React's useRef hook is also used here to initialize a reference to pass into the button. And also we have this, this click outside handler. So if you have a disclosure widget that's open and you click outside your disclosure widget, the disclosure widget will close. Now this pattern is important because we only want to have one disclosure widget open on the page at a time. And we have this click outside handler is being paired with something else here. It is being paired with the use effect hook. So in this disclosure widget, if we have a disclosure widget on the page and that disclosure widget is open, we are going to add some event listeners, listening for whether the user has clicked the mouse or any other key. And if so, we're just going to look, we're going to keep that, if we're clicking in basically that event listener in the top, my cat is distracting me. The event listener, when you add the event listener, it's listening for when the container is open. And if you have more than one disclosure widget on the page, it's going to remove any other event listeners that are listening for open widgets. And this component will not re-render over and over again because we passed in the isOpen prop to the end of this useEffect hook to make sure that this component doesn't re-render unless the isOpen state changes. Also, if the component happens to unmount from the UI, we are also cleaning up the event listeners and removing any mouse up and key up event listeners for this component. Last thing we're going to add to this useEffect before we go into demos and show how we can apply this is we're going to add this first item ref check. So in this useEffect hook, we have an if statement of if this widget is open, add the event listener for mouse up and key up. However, if also check, if someone has passed in when they're using this widget, they've passed in the first item ref prop, which is a ref that they've generated when they implement this component. If it's passed into the widget, focus on whichever item has received that reference. And also pass in that first item ref to the end of this useEffect hook to make sure it doesn't do any unnecessary re-renders. Now, I'm going to jump over real quick to a demo so you can see how these are applied in Code Sandbox. And I will share this Code Sandbox later on. So here, hello, here we go. This is a disclosure widget, patterns. So we have our disclosure widget. And I have comments on like how everything is controlled. So we have in our disclosure widget, we have our props. We declare whether the widget is open and the function for when it is to control when the open is true or false. And I'm passing in a default expanded prop here, which is whether we want this widget to be opened by default when the component loads in the page. And the default prop for the default expanded prop is set to false. So when you open the page, as you can see here, these three widgets are closed. I've also declared our refs for the button and the content ref, which is, sorry for scrolling so fast, which is down here. So we have our div with our key up handler and all the props we are passing in to our button. And we have our refs passed in. So we can do any type of focus management when we hit the escape key and also trigger whether this thing is hidden or not. So I'm going to go over here and I'm using my spacebar right now. I can also use my return key. I could use the escape key, but I'm screen sharing in Zoom and Zoom loves to hijack my focus. Let me see if it does it. Oh, it does. Okay, as long as I don't hide the floating meeting controls, I hit the escape key, focus has moved back to this generic disclosure widget pattern. We can take this pattern and make it into different types of patterns. It's the same pattern under the hood and we extrapolated it in different ways. For example, we have this pattern, which is a nice base pattern that you can use for things like a settings widget, a search menu, a toggle tip, not a tooltip, toggle tip. And all of these, when I hit tab, I can focus right to them, open and close it, tab to the next one, to the next one. And if you notice, as I tab through everything, the other one, the previous one closes because we have that click outside handler going here. So it's a really nice little pattern. But this is the generic pattern, and this is how I've extrapolated it. And I've extrapolated it here. The first one we'll show is, I'm going to show you the toggle tip first. So the toggle tip imports the disclosure widget using CSS modules here. It imports the disclosure widget, passes in an ARIA label for the button, and I'm gonna hide a couple things here because I think we have a little bit of time to do this. I'm going to hide the other ones. I'm going to hide in the app. I'm going to hide the basic widget so you can see more of the stuff. Okay. So back to the toggle tip and back to over here. Okay, so in the toggle tip. So here's the toggle tip. And in the toggle tip, hide a couple more. We're going to hide the other two until we are ready. 1 and 2. Okay, that's a lot easier for everyone to see. Okay. And, okay, so for this toggle tip here, close that, my apologies. This toggle tip, we have a disclosure widget. It is fruit trivia, so we're going to pass in an ARIA label because this is an icon-only button. And we're passing in some styles using CLSX library, just if we wanted to, like, we could concatenate styles if we want to. We could just pass in any styles if we want. We don't need, actually, technically don't need that part of it. But so you can pass in your ARIA label, so you make this more informative. You're going to pass in some classes to override the styles of our basic pattern to make an pattern here. Pass in what icon we want to add to that button's icon. And so that's what we're passing in for the button styles. And in the children, for the disclosure widget, we are passing in a div. And in that div, we are passing in a paragraph with a link. And there you go. There's a toggle tip that is implementing the disclosure widget pattern. Now let's go back really quickly, and we're going to go to toggle menu. Go back to toggle menu. Hide toggle search, so we can see all the stuff. So toggle menu, which is really it's a settings menu. It's not a navigation menu. So in our toggle menu, which opens up, if you want to check if you want to have apples, oranges, or grapes, we have here, we are importing our button component, a disclosure widget component, and our styles. We have an items array with our and we could use right now for buttons, we're not using links, but we're using just the title here. We are taking in our widget, passing in an unordered list to support our screen readers. So we can have an unordered list, and screen readers will know how many items are in this list, 3 items. And we're going to map the items of that array into a list that contains a button. And that is the disclosure widget that is using a settings menu, not a navigation menu. Lastly, we're going to look at the toggle search, because this uses the first item ref in the implementation. So in the toggle search, say you have a heading on your web page, and you want to search for something, and you click here and you just want to go in there and search, and then little search bar and search for things. You can do that with a disclosure pattern and then make it use a form inside. So you have your disclosure widget. You're going to pass in overrides for classes and icons and button sizes. But we're also going to pass in this first item ref, where we declared a ref here in our implementation. And we passed that ref into our input. And that's important. If you have a component in here, you may have to make sure your component supports a ref. And why this is important here is because you want to, when you're searching, you don't want to search and then tab into here. You want to exactly go right into the input and go and search. Now, I'm going to go back to my slides and wrap this up. Okay, back to my slides. Okay, so documentation. Most massive design systems out there definitely have some drool-worthy patterns for us to dream about. If your team is small, showing examples of the many ways your component can be used is a good first step. When we were rebooting our docs, we used Gatsby for our style guide to leverage the power of MDX, and storybooks to document our component playground. And it deployed our static instances of our docs using Zeitz now, which is now called Vercel these days and has derailed every single now pun that I've used until later. So I want to touch upon Storybook for a moment, though. It's a great way to sandbox your components in isolation and play with the UI logic without the complexities of business logic. And it supports MDX as well. The accessibility add-on is a must here. It uses the Axe Core engine and does a quick audit of your components until it identifies all your errors, tells you how serious they are, and gives you steps to fix them before you start your manual accessibility testing. Click. There we go. When documenting your components, you should add helpful hints to allow your developers to know how to choose how to implement your components. For example, how to implement an informative icon or a decorative icon. Be sure to add props tables to your components so your developers know which prop does what and what is required. Your adding component do's and don'ts to your documentation are essential. And dedicate a page to accessibility resources and links. The WCAG success criteria is really intense to parse. If you have curated any articles that help explain how to implement common accessibility patterns, add those to your docs. So, to wrap up, our users are diverse, and your design system is a cookbook. Cookbooks have a personality. React is a kitchen utensil. You are the cook. Components are your tried and true recipes. WCAG is your reference material. Document, document, document. And remember, dinosaurs are always the hotness. Thank you.
I'm talking on mute. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was amazing. We have just a couple of minutes here for a few questions. I know a lot of you have asked them. I'm going to go with the ones that have received the most upvotes. Okay. That is something that you can do with these sessions. The first one, we'll go with that one last, actually. So the one with the most upvotes, how do you feel about modals? Should they be done away with altogether? That might be a loaded question.
That is a very loaded question. I would love the browser vendors to get together and make a consistent pattern that is straightforward for everyone to implement instead of having to do all these hacks. I know that I'm sure someone has talked about the dialogue element and whether it has support or not. I would love the browser vendors to work with any of these assistive technology vendors to test on ways to make this better and ways to get a consistent pattern of doing things. Personally, I'm going to get near my mic because a lot of these, like my disclosure widget patterns, for example, I leveraged a lot of Marcy Sutton's knowledge here for disclosure widgets patterns. And Marcy Sutton has also done a really good egghead video on a disclosure widget, a modal pattern in vanilla JavaScript, HTML and vanilla JavaScript. And that's a really good pattern. There's also one of the libraries that I use for modals is it's the React ARIA modal, I believe. So it's very, very lightweight, accessible implementation of the pattern, and it has the focus management that I've used in components where it's something that the developers can use, and they don't have to think about focus traps and scrolling and everything else. It will be implemented in a more straightforward way. All you have to do is add a couple hooks when you implement it, and the focus management is set for you. Another one I've used when React ARIA modal isn't working is the Reach UI dialog, but I've noticed that it seems to be a kind of noisy in screen reader, so I don't fully recommend that one, but I like the React ARIA modal library because it seems to think about all the attributes that you need to implement a good modal. Yeah.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, I think we are at time. The question that did get the most votes is, can we see Thor throughout? Everybody saw glimpses. I don't know.
Did they see glimpses? Did they see me going?
I think so. I think that's why.
Did he hop up top? Did he hop up top? Oh my God. Sure. I'm gonna tweet photos of Thor because.
Okay, great.
Just like, why? Of course he had to meow now, and like,
yeah,
he's really good at hijacking my lack of focus with certain things. I'm just like, you're not
Yep.
keeping me on task, dude.
Totally get it. But this was an awesome session. So much engagement in the chat and a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. So perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, Kathleen, if people reached out to you on Twitter, if there was any looming questions, that would be great. Thank you so much for a great session. Thank you everyone for attending, no matter what time of day it is where you're at. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of AxeCon.